Okay. So, Kevin, do the dedications before we start the Gemara share and teach us.
Dedication to all the Cholim Klal Yisrael, Aryeh Leib ben Leah, Yeshua ben Shulamit, and all the people, especially the soldiers, many injured soldiers recovering in rehab hospitals. They should have a speedy refuah shlema and be out of there ASAP, and the hostages should be released unconditionally, and the soldiers should be successful in their mission, wiping out the enemy and returning home safely unscathed.
Amen.
Okay, so this week's parsha, and it was very interesting, Damon, that you sent those images of the warp and the weft in a garment, because it's in this week's parsha, but this week's parsha talks about afflictions. It's called Tazria, which is a derivative, or could be the root word of the word tsarat, or tsaras, which is an affliction, and it's usually in temple times, if people spoke Lashon Hora, or negative, or even evil, probably evil speech, they developed a something on their skin and on the scalp, and after a few days, let's say it was red in color, if it turned white, once it became white, the person got confirmation from the Kohen, and they were clear, and they could, I think they had to isolate themselves in a camp and be isolated. Also, the isolation was to teach them and to remind them not to speak negatively or gossip about people. But once the skin started healing, it usually became white, then they were free to rejoin their brethren in the camp. And it also, the thing that Damon sent was these afflictions could develop in a garment. I'm not sure or in the actual warp and the weft, and it had to be burnt. So, but this is the reason why these afflictions, or like sores, or lesions, appeared on the skin or scalp of people.
Thanks, Kev. Please God, I hope, Arthur, you make a refuah shalema with your procedure.
Amen.
It's tomorrow, is that right?
Amen. Yeah, it's tomorrow. I'm going in at got to be at the hospital at 9:15 now.
In the morning or in the evening? In the morning.
Morning. Hopefully it's not morning, but yeah, morning.
Arthur, don't say anything negative. What's the matter with you?
And then at 3 o'clock.
Okay. So you got to be in it at 9 a.m., but the procedure's at 3. They got to prep you.
Yeah, they get me ready. They prep me up. They give me Clixan and all that stuff so my blood from clotting. Even though I don't have a problem with that at the moment.
So we're going to get started. I want to basically also be able to cover a Mishnah so that it can help you in addition to the Gemara. Just pausing.
It's not ideal, but take what you can get.
All right, so guys, let me tell you what we're dealing with here. There's a clause in the Mishnah that reads, but one may purchase from married women. Okay? What are we talking about here? A concept of whom you can purchase from and whom you can't. In the event that if you purchase from somebody that bought stolen items, you obviously certainly can't purchase. But if there's a suspicion, we can eliminate this suspicion by avoiding certain purchases. In a very, very simple way, one of the things we learned is that if you're buying from an employee, that certainly, if you're buying from a person that works at a car dealership as a administrative clerk, okay, and they want to sell you a Porsche, clearly they're not earning enough to own the Porsche. Okay, this is the concept that we're dealing with. So here we're dealing with the Gemara. The next issue is that you can purchase from married women woolen garments in Judea and linen garments in the Galilee. So what does that actually entail? Is that we said that it was not uncommon that wool was produced in the Judea, Samaria area, and linen in Galilee, but we may not purchase from them wine, oil, or flour. And the reason being is that men generally undertake to sell those items themselves and do not send their wives to do so. And when we see women selling these items, we suspect that they stole them from their husbands, according to Rashi. Okay. Now, wine, oil, or flour, they were predominantly sold by men. But anything to do with garments, etc., will more feminine sort of trades. Now, we are not allowed to purchase anything from slaves or children. The reason being is that they cannot own their own property, or children are legal minors and they don't have independence, just like indentured servitude, etc. So you can assume it was stolen, or they didn't have the consent of their parents in order to sell it, because they wouldn't have had a revenue source themselves. Abba Shaul says a woman may sell 4 or 5 dinners worth of things in order to make a keecha for her head. So the reason why the husband consents to this is she has to cover her head. So there are certain reasons. But if any of the married women from whom we permitted to purchase told the purchaser to hide the items they were selling, it's obvious, because it's prohibited to buy from them, because if you're told to buy it in the corner of a marketplace, or you're told to hide it, it's obviously nefarious activities. And charity collectors can accept from them something small, in other words, small donations of money, but nothing substantial. Why? Because in those days, people were married in community of property. There wasn't really altogether anti-nuptial contracts, although there were certain ketubas that had a more complex nature. But it's standard for husbands to allow their wives to give small amounts of tzedakah, because there were many mishlochim, but not large amounts where it could affect the family's ability to survive. That's according to the Meiri. So whether the brisa means to permit taking small donations from slaves or children is well debated by the authorities. And it obviously comes from a verse in Shmot, in Exodus chapter 35, verse 22. And the men came with the women, all who were generous of heart, bought bracelets, nose rings, etc. So why did the men accompany their wives when it came to the construction of the tabernacle and the respective gifts and donations by the children of Israel? Is because they needed to show the actual consent for their wives' donations, because the amounts were substantial. And without the assurance of their husband's consent, the tabernacle's treasurers would have been forbidden to accept such expensive gifts. And that's where we're basing this on. Regarding olive presses, we may buy from them, in other words, from the wives of olive presses, and olives in large amounts and oil in large amounts. Why? Well, quite simply, a woman is unable to steal large amounts of olives and oil and sell them discreetly. Hence, you can buy items in quantities. Very much what we learn from a shepherd is that you can buy 4 or 5 sheep, because that quantity missing would be noticed from a stock take. And it's obvious that she would be selling them with her husband's consent, because on a basic stock inventory, it's too much to hide. But small amounts, however, can be sold by her discreetly without even her husband's knowledge. And therefore, we suspect that she stole the items from her husband, and they both have joint ownership and community of property. However, according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, although you can't generally buy olives or olive oil in small amounts, you can in the Upper Galilee, because in that particular area, oil was very expensive, and husbands and wives were particular about doing stock take on even small amounts, because the value there was extremely high. And you would notice even a small amount was missing. So she wouldn't risk stealing them out of fear for being caught. So we can say everything has to do with the price of a commodity. If you're selling bales of hay, the stock take isn't that severe. You'd notice it missing by the sheer size of the item, so that's one way to reveal theft. But the other way is to see what that value loss of attrition would be, or pilfering, etc. Now, if you were in the cocaine business or the heroin business, if a couple of grams went missing every day, in the old days with the Menendez cartel, with when you were dealing with Pablo Escobar, he would line somebody up against the wall and have them shot over small amounts. So there, because you're dealing with a very expensive commodity, and I hope that the amount of misery that he caused in the world, he single-handedly got the West hooked on cocaine. I hope he's rotting in hell. Anyway, that's just a little bracha for the day. But at times a man is embarrassed to sell olives at the entrance of his house, even in the Upper Galilee, where it would fetch a higher price. So therefore, he gives them over to his wife to sell. So although it's generally uncommon for a man to have his wife sell the items for him, since it's unlikely in this case she'd be risk stealing, we've got to assume that the husband was embarrassed to sell at the entrance of his own house, and he had his wife sell the olives for him at the market, because they might have been impoverished, and that little amount of oil, especially in the Upper Galilee, would have fetched a higher sum. So she would sell it, would be less awkward for him. So the Gemara relates, Ravina visited the city of Mechoza to collect charity. And the woman of Mechoza come and placed before him golden chains and bracelets, all gold. And he accepted them from them. So Rabbi Tosfa said to Ravina, look, we just learned in a brisa that charity collectors may take from the wives small amounts, because the husband would consent. It wouldn't affect their financial position, but not something substantial. So Ravina said to him, listen, these items of gold chains and gold bracelets are nothing. They're considered something small in Mechoza for the inhabitants, because they're very, very wealthy. So everything is contextually related. I'm going to share the screen. So please, God, Arthur, you make Hashem blesses you with a full refuah, and just read it properly. If you have to read it once to yourself, do so, but just make sure it's read properly, because this is for your health. Amen.
Amen, amen.
Hold on. Okay. The Mishnah above discussed which items may be bought from laborers. This Mishnah rules on a related topic. Which of the craftsman's leftover materials or byproducts belong to him, and which belong to the owner of the original materials? The threads of wool that the launderer of the woolen garments removes during the soaking process belong to him, but the threads that the tessella?
Perfect.
What's a tessella?
I'll explain.
Oh, the tessella. Okay. Removes belongs to the owner. The launderer takes out 3 threads, and they belong to him. If he took out more than that, they belong to the owner. But if it was a black on white, he may take off all of the black threads, and they belong to him. If a tailor left over enough thread with which to sew, or a piece of cloth that is at least 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths, they belong to the owner. The Mishnah now addresses itself to the craft of carpentry. Whatever shavings a carpenter removes with an adze belongs to him, but whatever chips he chops off with a hatchet belongs to the owner. However, if he was working on the owner's premises, even the sawdust belongs to the owner.
Excellent, mate. So this Mishnah bottom line deals with 2 different forms of labor. The one are contractual workers, and the other are employees or laborers that's paid just for their time and not for project management. Okay, and the halachas are different. So the craftsman of whatever nature has leftover materials or byproducts belonging to him, and which belong to the owner of the original materials. So what are we trying to learn here? If you're buying products from the person that was paid an hourly wage for the services they provide, generally at the owner's premises, you can be sure that you're not entitled to keep it. If it's a contractor, you can keep it, providing the offcuts or the remaining leftover materials isn't substantial in terms of amount. And also, one of the things that we're dealing with is if it's at the location or premises of the contractor. So in other words, you hire a carpenter to do work for you, and he's got a workshop factory in Weinberg or whatever the case may be. He's entitled to a heck of a lot more than if it's a tsipo that comes to your house to do the labor, believe me. So these are some of the issues at play. Now, it talks about the shreds of wool that a launderer of woolen garments removes during the soaking process belong to him. So it belongs to the launderer. So if he wants to sell some of the shreds to you, he can. But what actually are we talking about here? So when a launderer soaks a woolen garment, there's a minuscule amount of wool that is washed from the garment. Generally, the owner doesn't care for those small woolen particles to be returned to him, and hence the launderer may keep them for himself. Furthermore, guys, even if a certain owner is particular about them and wishes for them to be returned, the launderer may still keep them for himself. Why? There's a principle in the Gemara that says there's a condition of abnormality and normality. So in other words, the attitude of the owner regarding those shreds, if it's considered abnormal behavior that almost any other person will let go of it, we don't reckon with it, as Rashi says. It's a principle known as his idea is nullified because it is overwhelmed by all other people. So it's a principle found throughout the Talmud and means that in most situations, any normal person, not somebody that's psychologically deranged, has a custom of behavior, and its definition has to do with the general prevailing attitude, not by the unreasonable behavior of the individual in question. So in other words, if somebody is being overly pedantic or unreasonable or being petty compared to normative standards, it's ignored. If it's within reason that some people are lackadaisical and some are more particular, but there's enough opinion to say, might have a moderate amount of people that would find a certain amount of pilferage unreasonable, and others that say they would forego tiny amounts. We take the prevailing attitude into account, but not the abnormal behavior of a particular individual. Do you get what I'm saying? And it's the same concept, guys, that we're dealing with Yeush. Remember Yeush? Kevin asked a good question. He says, well, how do you know a person's actually given up? And one of the answers is that would most people give up in that situation of having retrieved that particular item that was lost? Well, if there are no markings on the item that would define it as yours, you had a generic wallet which wouldn't indicate that you bought it at a particular store, and there was money in it, you could add a sufficient amount of time has passed, maybe a year. If you're still mourning over that money, you need your head checked. Okay. So Arthur asked a good question now. Remember, Arthur, you were asking, what is this thing? What's a teasler? What is a teasler? Because it says, but the shreds that a teasler removes belong to the owner. Okay. Now, what it was, as it comes, Arthur, if you tease fabric, I don't mean if you tease a dog. If you tease a dog, you're going to get bitten. But if you're known as teasing fabric or tesseling fabric. It's a process of finishing process for cloth. Okay, so a tessel or tezel is a thistle head with prominent sparkly bristles. Okay, it's like a special brush, and a number of tassels are bound together to form a tassel brush. And this laundering process causes a woolen garment to shrink and harden. So I remember I once took my suit to a Chinese guy to dry clean. I don't know what he did, but it came back looking to fit a Smurf. And I'm not the tallest guy, but even I couldn't get into it. And therefore, sometimes after in the laundering process, especially in those days, today what happens is when you buy items of clothing from China, they pre-wash it. I don't know if you know that. Most items are already pre-washed and have gone through a process so that there's not going to be further shrinkage. But when it was pre-industrial, you had fabrics behaving in a very, very different way according to heat and moisture and stretching, etc. So therefore, after the laundering, the garment was given to a teasler who brushed the garment up with a tessel brush. And what happens is the tessler first stretches the fabric upon the frame, and when the fabric is sufficiently taut, meaning it's tightened, you brush it with this tessel brush in one direction, and the bristles gently pluck at the wool on the surface, and the fiber has now become soft, and they have to be trimmed easily. So besides softening the surface, tesseling also conceals the crisscross pattern of the threads, giving the fabric more of a pleasant, solid look instead of this harsh sort of feeling. It's like fabric softener in a way, and it makes the fabric warmer for its wearer. Today we use chemicals for this a lot. Then they had to use actual implementation. Okay, now in the modern era it seems very obscure to us, but there are people that have dealt with this sort of issue. I just want to go through the Mishnah and see. Now, and that if he took out more than that, they belong to the owner. Now we talk about a launderer. The launderer takes out 3 threads and they belong to him. If he took out more than that, they belong to the owner. So what we are saying is here is that if you have a look, how do I put this in a simple way? Look, it's standard for weavers to weave an extra 3 threads of another material at the edge of woolen garments, because why you want to put another 3 stitches is you don't want the garment to unravel in the laundering process. So what happens is the launderer pulls these out afterwards and straightens out the edge of the garment, and it beautifies it. So it's almost a protective measure. So in that case, it's fairly straightforward, because let me just put it like this. I'm just trying to think of the process where it's not going to be too complicated. So if he takes out more than 3 threads, they all belong to the owner, because generally the owner is prepared to be pretty agreeable if only 3 threads are taken. But if the launderer gets cute and he decides to take more than that, he actually forfeits his 3 threads, because if you deviate from common practice and courtesy, we punish the launderer, because at that point the owner of the garment is going to get a little bit pedantic and he's not allowed to keep anything, the launderer. So why? Because the owner's attitude would change from being agreeable to wanting everything back. So it's not just a punishment. Generally, people are more generous if you don't push your luck. Okay? So, but if it was black on white, what are we talking about? If black threads were woven on the edge of a white garment, in that particular case, he may take all the black threads and they belong to him, because the launderer is not going to leave black threads on white. It's just going to not beautify the garment at all. and it's going to actually affect and ruin the appearance of a white garment. So then the owner is in particular, because he wants a good-looking garment in a consistent color. Now, if it was black on white, he may take off all the black threads and they belong to him. Either way. Now, if you've got a tailor and he left over enough thread with which to sew, or he's got a piece of cloth that is at least 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths, they belong to the owner. So the tailor basically made a garment he was sewing by cutting off a piece of measured material by 3 finger breadths square. And that's for use of a patch. If it's that amount of size and the fabric's expensive, they belong to the owner. If it's less, the owner's not going to be pedantic. Let's look at carpentry. Now, in adze, as it's pronounced, I had to look up what it was. Okay, what it actually is, it's a cutting tool that has a thin arched blade set at right angles to the handle, and it's used chiefly for shaping and dressing wood. So the Mishnah says that when a carpenter uses like the small tool, because you get a big adze and a small adze, and a small one will only use you'd lose a small amount of wood or fine shavings, nothing that dramatic, and that would be planed off by a carpenter. So the owner isn't that perturbed. But if you start to use an axe or a hatchet, then a substantial amount of wood is lost, and therefore that belongs to the owner, because now it's getting quite expensive. Now, we're saying if the contractor wasn't a contractor, but he was more of a skilled laborer that was paid for the day or per hour, and he was working on the owner's premises, even the sawdust belongs to the owner, because when a carpenter draws a hole, for example, and there's shavings or whatever the case may be, it's all falling on the owner's premises. So there's no entitlement for the laborer to keep that. However, if it's a carpenter that has a special skill set, especially if it's being done in his premises, in that case, he's entitled to keep a small amount of the carvings. Okay, so Rashi's got a slightly different explanation. Okay, I'm just going to give it to you guys. Give me 1 sec. So Rashi explains the Mishnah's distinction to be between a day or an hourly worker and a contractor, regardless of where they perform their labor. Okay, so I'm just going to say, when you're dealing with a contractor, according to Rashi, he quotes for the job. When you're dealing with a laborer, there's either a daily fee or an hourly fee. And that's the determinant factor, that a laborer cannot keep any of the materials that are left behind. He keeps nothing, but a contractor does, providing it's a reasonably small amount. But the Rambam, Maimonides, has a different opinion. He says everything is contingent upon where the work is done. So when the work is done on the owner's premises, even by a contractor that charges for the project, the shavings and the sawdust belong to the owner. And where the work is done, even on by a day laborer or an hourly wage earner, they belong to the worker. Why? Because he's using his own premises. And the cost to schlep some of the small peripheral wood, etc., doesn't pay the owner to do so. And he can't expect the laborer to do that at his cost for something not substantial. So according to the Tos Yom Tov, he says that Rashi doesn't mean to differentiate between an hourly wage earner and a contractor per se. Rather, Rashi just mentions this case of an hourly wage earner or contractor because generally, what's the general rule? Is that a day worker works on his premises because he doesn't have that much money, whereas a contractor has a proper workshop. And as he was saying, the reason for the distinction is that when you work in your own premises and compared to if you work on the owner's premises, the difference lies in this. When you work on the owner's premises, The latter usually pays the overhead and wishes to keep all the leftover material because you're working at him. And according to the SMA, that when the work is done on the worker's premises, it doesn't pay the owner to go through the bother of transporting the sawdust, the planed wood shavings, etc. So leave them for the carpenter. However, when the work is done on his own premises, there's no bother involved. So he's quite particular about keeping all the shavings. So as we say, Rashi, according to most opinions, holds it depends if it's a contractor or daily or hourly wage worker, whereas the Rambam says it's premises dependent, and the Tosfot Yom Tov said that Rashi was just using a contractor versus a laborer to illustrate that most laborers don't have their own workshop premises as opposed to contractors. And that's the bundle, guys. I'm not going to go through the Gemara now. It's a Mishnah.
Scott, yeah, no, that's
also,
yeah. Well, we had to do that for Arthur anyway. So, well, Scott, to you, Damon, and Arthur, best of luck for tomorrow. Eh?